Hello, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to this year's Aims of Public Policy address. Normally, this event is exclusively for our incoming students, but this year, because of the magic of Zoom, we're able to welcome returning Harris students, staff, faculty, alumni, friends of the institution to turn in virtually to this year's address. So I welcome you all. For those of you who are incoming students, it may have felt like a pretty long couple of weeks that you've just gone through between math camp and coding camp and mathematical methods. So I hope that you can take this moment to take a big, deep breath and get ready to dive into your coursework. This is one of my favorite events of the year, in part because it gives you a moment to reflect before that coursework on why it is that you're here and what you're hoping to get out of Harris. And I know for our first year students, whether you're in the PhD program or the master's program, the first year courses can be challenging and are designed to be an incredibly flexible toolkit. The things that you'll learn this year will help you dive into the things that are motivating you to come to Harris right now, but will also be incredibly valuable as you go forward to address the problems of the future that maybe no one is thinking about right now. And that's why we think the first year toolkit is so important. But that can also make it a little challenging because it may feel at times abstract from what motivated you to come, from the problems that are driving you. Even though, of course, there are lots of examples and ways to apply it, it's really good to touch base with yourself throughout your first year to think, what am I hoping to get out of this? How am I going to apply the toolkit? How's this helping me answer the questions that are motivating me? Because I think there's so much that you can do with the tools that you'll be acquiring. That's also one of the reasons this is one of my favorite events, which builds on the college's longstanding Aims of Education address dating back to 1962. The goal of this talk is to kick off your academic year with remarks from a faculty member that illustrate how we can take the approaches, the tools, the analytical thinking that you learn at Harris and apply it to really make a difference in the world for some of the most important issues. And tonight's example is a wonderful opportunity to do that. I'm so glad to be able to welcome Professor Stephen Durloff, the Staines Professor in Educational Policy. Professor Durloff's work spans many topics in microeconomics and macroeconomics, but he focuses in particular on poverty, inequality, and economic growth, such pressing policy problems always, but especially salient now. So much of his research has drawn on a wide array of intellectual traditions. And again, that's one of the advantages of being at a place like Harris, is being able to draw on learnings from across disciplines. His work draws on sociology, economics, econometrics, to think about what affects intergenerational poverty transmission and mobility and economic opportunity within a country like the US, but also across countries. In his efforts to answer those questions, he's not only drawn on cutting edge tools, but he's developed new tools to try to answer questions that were otherwise intractable, thinking about new models and new approaches to rigorously assessing how different factors play out in economic opportunities across the income distribution, and particularly in alleviating poverty and inequality. His work spans many countries, thinking about what we can learn from others' experiences, as well as what's driving opportunity or the lack thereof in the United States. He's developed methods that many other researchers use, as well as in his own work. And so he's a wonderful example of the importance of the toolkit speaking to the problems that we care about and the problems informing the toolkit that we need. So I am delighted to welcome him to give this year's address and to welcome you all to Harris. Professor Durloff?
I hope everybody can see me. First of all, Kate, thank you for that very flattering introduction. It means a lot. The most important thing to say, of course, to all of you is welcome. I'm looking forward to teaching you. I'm looking forward to interacting with even more of you. And I hope, and I'm very confident this is going to be an incredibly exciting 2 years of your lives. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about something called the Great Gatsby Curve. Many of you may have read the novel, The Great Gatsby, and I have to admit this is a case where economists have appropriated a title from literature to to characterize a relationship. The serious idea in thinking, and what I want to talk about today, is to consider both the nature of inequality cross-sectionally, as well as intergenerationally. And so let's just start off. I want to tell you what the Great Gatsby curve is. It was an observation that if you looked at different countries in the world, and you asked what's the relationship between two fundamental facets of inequality, one of them being cross-sectional, for example, what's the distribution of incomes across individuals in 2021? How does that link? How is that related to a different measure of inequality, which would be the extent to which the prospects of individuals as adults are constrained by the circumstances of their family incomes? And so what it's doing intuitively is it's trying to look at a bivariate relationship between inequality and mobility. And so what the Gatsby curve here, and this is due to Miles, the figures due to Miles Korak, a leading scholar on this, is it looked at a number of economies and simply asked what the relationship is, and it found there's a positive relationship. And what that means is the countries that exhibited more inequality at a point in time in a year also exhibited greater persistence of socioeconomic status across generations. Now, this was a very big deal in policy discussions when it was publicized, and it has to do with the following. And that is, if we think about equality, inequality, one objective might be equality of outcomes. We'd like individuals not to vary too much in their consumption of food, for example, or in terms of medical care, or in terms of income, of course. A different question is understanding inequalities of opportunities, and intergenerational measures are trying to capture that different facet of inequality. Now, many of you are going to know that one of the American mythos is that this is a country which has enormous opportunity, and as a result is willing to tolerate quite a bit of cross-sectional inequality. So from the vantage point of the myth, this figure was very disturbing, because if you take a look at it, you'll see the United States seems to have relatively high inequality and persistence of socioeconomic status. In contrast, if you were to look at Scandinavia, they're in the bottom. And so they have both low inequality and and relatively little persistence between parents and children. And so just as a policy matter, this actually appeared in discussions in campaigns, because it was focusing on whether or not, in the American case, the inequalities, which are greater in the US, as is well known in Europe in particular, were they coming associated with greater opportunities? Certainly from the vantage point of the conventional measures of intergenerational mobility, they weren't. The US was doing relatively poorly in both. And so that has stimulated enormous amounts of research in the last decade, trying to understand this relationship. But does mobility beget inequality? Does the inequality beget mobility? And if so, what are the mechanisms that underlie it? How can we ameliorate them? So I think that really, putting down this bold, statistical relationship immediately leads to three questions, which I want to focus on. The first question is no deeper than just asking, actually, what is the relationship between inequality and mobility? I showed you a picture. It showed there's a positive relationship, but let's sort of dig into that more deeply and ask, what are the natures of the links? The second question is, well, supposing that the relationship is indeed there, and I'm not going to, treat this like the end of a movie where I'm going to reveal something. Yes, I believe it's there. The second question is going to be, what explains it? In other words, what are the mechanisms that link the two? And finally, once we have a vision of the correct facts, and we have a correct vision of the underlying behavioral explanations, where's the potential role of policy? So the first issue I want to put on the table is really, what are the tools that are needed to assess this relationship? Okay, this is purely a factual matter. If somebody makes a claim that countries that have higher inequality also have lower mobility, how do you assess that? How do you read that? How would you, if you were advising a policymaker, communicate those facts to them? And here I want to put on the table, there's really four things that you're going to want to think about. And let me say that really what I'm going to do in talking through the Great Gatsby curve in these different facets, my objective is not, well, I hope I'll persuade you that my particular views on it are correct, but more importantly, I want you to see how the tools that Harris will teach let you address these questions and think them through. And so what I'm putting on the table simply is that the first question you have to ask is whether the measurements are credible as stated. Is it the case that the statistics that are given for mobility, for inequality, do we think that they're grounded in appropriate data construction? Second question is going to be that if the data are appropriately constructed, and I'm computing statistics, is there an actual relationship? In other words, the data, they don't exactly speak for themselves. You have to figure out, sometimes you've got to listen carefully and see whether or not the evidence is strong and whether it's weak. The third thing you have to think about is whether or not these are even the appropriate measures of inequality and mobility. In other words, inequality and mobility are very complicated phenomena. And quantitative research, both theoretical and empirical, is taking these very high dimensional phenomena and somehow coming up with low dimensional approximations. And one has to think about whether the approximations are doing what one wants. And then the final thing is to ask whether or not it even makes sense to think about mobility and inequality as separate things. Maybe they're all part of the same story. So what sort of answers do I think you're going to hear or you would learn from being at Harris? I think the first thing I would say is that you will hear much about the importance of actually understanding the nitty-gritty of data construction. It may not be glamorous, but it is fundamental to the social science endeavor, be it the positive endeavor of understanding, the normative endeavor of policy or recommendations. And so some of the important work at Harris that's being done, for example, is the very careful examination of poverty statistics and asking questions about how do you interpret claims by individuals they have zero income when in fact they obviously are consuming things, and so that couldn't be the case. And so an important research group at Harris in fact studies exactly those data construction questions and proposes superior measures. This answer to the second question, well, given it, once we understand how the data work, what is it we learn from in terms of relationships between inequality measures, mobility measures? That's where statistical theory comes in. In other words, you have to ask basic questions associated with whether or not the correlations, are they strong enough to be attributable to an actual relationship, or do they have to be, are they just an artifice of sampling error? Many of you have been exposed to basic statistics, and so you're familiar with those types of questions. But again, they're essential in asking what one makes of this observed and very provocative relationship. Now, I see that I was so excited about the importance of social science theory. I wrote it twice. I wanted to say that social science theory is what you bring to bear on the data when you want to understand the meaning of these relationships. So what do I mean by that? One question is whether or not, from the perspective of theory, does it even make sense to look at these relationships? So what could I possibly mean by that? Well, I want you to think about the Great Gatsby curve. One of the things it did was it compared the levels of inequality and mobility of Norway with the United States. Now, Norway has 5.5 million people. The United States has about 335 million people. So the ratio of populations is 60-1. And my point is, of course, it's not just a matter of scale. The United States is a much more essentially heterogeneous society, be it with respect to ethnicity, with respect to the immigration history of the United States, with respect to the very facts of the histories of the countries, and not to mention scale, size. And so what social science theory helps you do is think about whether it even makes sense to put these observations in the same regression. Now, there aren't going to be algorithms for making those judgments, and that's part of the hard thing you're going to learn here is there's not that judgments are needed and are stronger than any algorithms can be. But that's going to be the upshot of learning how to translate interesting empirical relationships into interpretable objects. And the final thing I wanted to say is you actually need probability theory to think about these. And what, in the sense, are they distinct? And so I wrote here 3 cheers for stochastic processes. Now, the reason I wrote that is partially something that the dean said, which is the courses are going to be pretty technical the first year in particular, because they're going to be teaching tools. And it will be natural to think that, well, how do these things map to the real world? And I am willing to, I could say I've staked my career on. I seriously believe they absolutely are related. And part of what our job is as instructors in the school as institution is to demonstrate that. So here's an example. So a very brilliant postdoc here named Sasha Lukina, Larry Bloom, and I have actually proposed measures of intergenerational mobility, which have this mathematical form. I'm never going to make you look at it again. Well, I'll look at it for 2 seconds. The point is, I don't want you to know how to derive this form. What I want you to understand is what it means. What it says, if you want to think about the mobility in society, you need some way of saying, here's where we are in inequality today, and we want to ask how much memory will today's inequality carry over next period, next period, next period, and next period. There's a way to say that mathematically, but you can see the intuitions are very powerful. And that's, I would say, the burden of that every professor here faces in interacting with you, is to demonstrate that the tools have substantive relevance. So that's kind of the first thing I would say, is you actually have to figure out what's in the data. In other words, is there a robust relationship between the two? And if there's a robust relationship, is it merely an artifice of the fact that the appropriate way to think about inequality is that there's inequalities at a point in time, they evolve dynamically, and that's what gives you in the jargon and probability theory a stochastic process. Once you have those determined, that's when one can begin to think about mechanisms. And so the Great Gatsby curve has, perhaps unsurprisingly, generated a rich set of candidate explanations. And I think these explanations can be put in 4 categories. So I want to give you a brief sense of what the 4 are, and then I'm going to tell you my preferred one and try to make a case as to why I think that it says something that's important. One way to think about the relationship, or maybe the way that anybody, one must think about a relationship between inequality and mobility, is to ask the following question, and that is, if I increase the amount of cross-sectional inequality, does that slow down the rate of mobility? That's, after all, what the Gatsby curve, in a counterfactual sense, in a loose sense, is trying to speak to. Now, the curve doesn't demonstrate that, because correlation is not causation. The point of going to theory is to figure out what the mechanisms are, what the actual explanations are. And one set of theories would explain why more inequality begets greater persistence simply by looking at family dynamics. Parents make investments in their children. Those investments are both financial and they have to do with time. And so you can then ask the question, if I were to spread out rich versus poor families and sort of enhance that heterogeneity, does that tend to lock in the kids? And so there's going to be conditions under which that's what's going to happen. If I attenuate, or if I exacerbate inequalities between families, that's going to mean that some families have much less time that can be devoted because both parents are working full time, or there may be a single family in which there's different types of trade-offs. But in every case, you're going to get bigger gaps in what individual families do for their kids, and that by itself would explain the Great Gatsby curve. A second set of theories don't focus on the family directly, but they're really social theories. And what these theories say is that what is important in thinking about inequality and mobility is how children develop in social environments, and these social environments condition their opportunities as adults. And so these types of explanations, they focus less on families as direct investors, how much a parent reads to a child, or how many books you buy per se, but they look at things such as schools and neighborhoods. In other words, parents' income matters, but the reason it matters is because parents help they make choices, obviously constrained choices, as to where children grow up, who they interact with, what schools they attend. And so that becomes a different type of theory. And that's the one I'm going to focus on in the subsequent discussion. A third set of theories are what I'm going to call political economy theories. And this is where I will defer to the political scientist colleagues here at Harris. A question you can ask is, as inequality increases, what does that do to the policies that are implemented by a government? If, for example, you thought that the higher income increases political influence, then you could sort of see how a story would generate a Gatsby curve. You have exacerbation of the gaps between the rich and the poor. That enhances political power differences between the rich and the poor. That means that the policies that are implemented are going to be relatively good for the rich as opposed to the poor, and that would slow down mobility. Now, everything I said there is perfectly sensible. It can all be axiomatized in terms of formal theory, but it's all political. It's all empirically controversial. But I want you to see it constitutes a body of theories. The final set of theories that I want to mention is something I'm going to call cultural capital. And those are explicit efforts to move beyond the logic of economic models, to think of individuals in terms of the psychologies in which that they have, and the ways in which their development gives them what I would call cultural capital to let them succeed relatively well or relatively poorly. So what would that mean? An example of cultural capital would be the facility with which families know how to navigate a school system. A different example would be taking these not necessarily perfectly rational beings called teenagers and asking, how do they form aspirations about going to college? What's feasible, what's not? Now, I think that ultimately this is a distinct theory. At this point in time, it's a subset of it probably can be linked with the social theories, but I want you to recognize that part of the successful theoretical research in thinking about a phenomena such as the Gatsby curve is the breaking of disciplinary barriers. Family investment theories in their first generation were pretty, I'll say, hardcore neoclassical economics, parents making decisions to allocate their incomes between themselves and investments in their children. But those theories evolved across time to take seriously ideas in social psychology and in developmental psychology to think about investments at different points in time and the ways in which both personality traits and conventional human capital were evolved in response to parental inputs. Social theories are very indebted to both to psychology, to anthropology, and most importantly to sociology, because they focus on how social influences, peer effects, role models, and the like have implications for how people make choice, how they succeed or don't in the economy. Political economy, of course, by definition, almost is a combination of logic from game theoretical perspectives with political science. Cultural capital, again, I would say is an amalgam of ideas from psychology, sociology, and to be honest, relatively little from economics at this point. But that's part, again, of what the interdisciplinary approach of Harris gives you. The problems that you're going to be thinking about, be they macro problems such as the overall level of intergenerational mobility in a country, or micro problems such as what's the right way to allocate children across classrooms in an elementary school if you're trying to maximize something about their academic skills at the end of sixth grade. All of those ultimately require integrating all of these different perspectives. Now, let me say a little bit about a half of what you're going to learn here that's related to all this. And that's what's called, you may have heard the term before, the identification problem. I gave you 4 explanations that I think you would say intuitively, yeah, they all make sense. How do I tell which ones matter? Do they all matter? Do some of them matter? How could I distinguish them empirically? Well, that's what the identification problem is. In other words, many of the tools you're going to learn here are how to identify different phenomena in the data. So think about social versus family factors. That's a textbook example of identification. If I say that a parent's income predicts a child's income, is it because the parent's income is correlated with the parent's education and highly educated parents push their kids to be highly educated? Or is it that the parent's income buys a membership in a neighborhood, and so higher income parents buy access to better schools, buy access to communities that suffer fewer disadvantages? I could go on with all of that. All I want to say here is that there actually is good evidence for all of these mechanisms. And that's, again, an important point, is not to think about theories as in competition when they aren't logically so. And in this case, the theories are what I've called in other work open-ended. They're all mutually compatible and they're all parts of the puzzle. So as I said, my own theories or my own interests tend to be focused on the social theories. And so I want to sort of tell you how I would go about thinking about this social perspective. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to give you a few more facts. And then I'm going to come up with a conclusion for it and then talk about policy. So I put on the table an observation across countries, and that is that, that there seems to be some positive relationship between the amount of inequality and the persistence of status. Here's some other facts that are specific to the United States. One of them is the following, and that is, and this is work that is associated with Raj Shetty, Nathan Hendren, and their research team, and that is that there's enormous heterogeneity and mobility in the United States. And so this is a very celebrated picture of the geography of upward mobility in the US, which shows that different regions of the US have very different levels of mobility. So what it means is you look at somebody whose parents are in the bottom fifth of the national income distribution, you ask what's the probability they'll be in the top fifth. That's very tight. It's in a very interesting way associated with where you grow up. So there's something about location that seems important for mobility. Here's a second fact. Okay, I went from a macro to a micro. Very disturbing but important work by Robert Manduca and Robert Sampson, sociologists. They've taken the city of Chicago and looked at it at the tract level of the city and constructed indices of social ills in various tracts. So what do I mean by that? They came up with indices that account for, in a very localized neighborhood, exposure to lead, levels of violence that children are exposed to, and levels of incarceration, the fraction of adults that are being removed from the community. These are the distributions of the census tracts for majority Black and majority white neighborhoods in Chicago. And you can see they scarcely overlap. Now, I put this on the table because in talking about mobility and inequality, I've spoken in kind of an individualistic way. I said there's people have inequalities and individuals that are cross-sectional and intergenerational. But of course, many of the salient inequalities in the United States are groups, and in particular have to do with race. And so another factor here is this capacity for, or the possibility that disadvantaged people are getting isolated in neighborhoods that have many social ills, and that's being compounded by racial segregation. Here's a third fact. Those of you that aren't from the United States may not know this, but much public finance of education between kindergarten and 12th grade, that's from 5 to 17, is generated by local revenue sources. And the United States has broken up into, I think, about 14,500, don't quote me on that, school districts. And what you find is that the individual school districts who have major revenue responsibility, rich districts are spending much more per capita than poor students. And so I picked Texas, not randomly, but because Texas I knew had particularly inegalitarian per pupil expenditures. But what you can find in Texas is ratios that, over 4 to 1 in terms of how much is spent per student. So you see, that begins to speak to why location might be important. Here's a couple of others I want to talk about. I've talked about kind of children. Now what about adolescents? In very interesting work, Christopher Avery and Caroline Hawksby essentially got the universe of students 1 year in the United States to look at where they applied to college. So you have the universe of SAT or ACT, SAT test takers, and then you knew things about family background. And what they found was there were thousands of children from poor families with high test scores that are not applying to elite colleges, even though they would receive full scholarships. And so this was kind of the distribution of what types of colleges higher income, higher achievers apply to. Relatively few are on the one tail, which is the less elite colleges using median SAT. I'm not reifying this as the truth on what's good or bad, but it's a measure. But what you saw was that the high test takers are by and large applying to schools that have very high median test scores. In contrast, if you look at poor children who had families with low incomes but were high achievers, over 40% were only applying to a local school regardless of quality. That's part of the story, in other words, and understanding why it is that when these opportunities would appear to be there, something's going on, which means that they're not being exercised. That's not to blame the kids saying, well, you should apply to these schools. It's saying something is going on in terms of the formation of aspirations, the way information about financial aid is being disseminated. Those micro things have macro consequences. And the final observation to make is that if you look at college quality, and there's various ways to measure that, what you find is substantial racial gaps in college quality. And so in putting these numbers together, what I was trying to give you a sense of is that in thinking about the inequality mobility nexus, the nexus is defined with respect to income inequality. There's also ethnic inequalities. And that's really where the horizons are going to be in the research and in policy. So these are the types of things that have led me to propose something I call the memberships theory of inequality. So let me just tell you what it is and why it would explain the Gatsby curve. The memberships theory, it's intuitively very straightforward. It basically says three things. The first claim is that if you look at the beliefs people have, the preferences they have, do I want to do this, want to do that, the opportunities, they're conditioned by group memberships. Some of those memberships are fixed. That's what, fixed in the sense that ethnic groups, gender, these may have fluidity, but for most people, they don't. In other cases, they're completely fluid. That's what it means to live in a certain neighborhood versus another, to attend a certain school versus another, to be working at a particular firm or an institution or an organization or another. What's key is that these dependencies are complicated in the sense that some of them exhibit a property called complementarity, which is a jargon to say that there are some people, I want to be similar to them. And so if they do something, I'm more likely to do it. If my friends were smokers in high school, I would be more likely to smoke than otherwise. In other cases, interactions are negative. And that's a way we would think about phenomena such as prejudice and discrimination. And so the idea number one is we think of individuals that they have these identities and there's kind of defined by the overlaps of all these different group memberships. And there's going to be this complicated interplay of certain types of positive interactions and certain types of negative interactions. Claim two, many of these memberships, because they're endogenous, they respond to the interactions. And so what you see if you're thinking about residential neighborhoods or firms or schools is segregation. Some types of segregation are racial. Other types of segregation are economic, rich people living together, poor people living together. Other types are skill-based. In other words, kids with higher test scores being more likely to be concentrated in certain schools than others. But all of them are saying the same idea. You think about inequality. When you put it in a social setting, it creates forces that are creating segregation. So people with different family incomes are experiencing different neighborhoods, different schools than others. And when you put them all together, that's a theory of persistent intergenerational inequality and poverty. The greater the inequality, the greater the isolation of people that are relatively disadvantaged, superimpose racial issues on top of that. And what you have is more inequality begets greater persistence. Now, the ideas are all very intuitive, but they actually lead to very interesting things. For example, and this is the transition from the ideas, the verbal analysis to the actual models, they have very complicated behaviors. In other words, you can have cases where, for example, neighborhoods will tip. You have certain compositions of ethnic compositions. If the fraction of African Americans goes up above a threshold, the whites all move out. That's called neighborhood tipping. These models all can explain those types of things. The second thing is they are very important in thinking about policy. The words can't do it. The theory, the mathematics does, and it demonstrates the policy effects in these worlds with which people have all these interdependencies. They are profoundly nonlinear. The fact that a 1% tax increase did this doesn't mean you can extrapolate a 2% by multiplying the first one by 2. And so you need theory to be able to do those things. And the final thing I want to say, just in terms of frontiers, is this is where you get work that lets you talk about how to address issues of the modeling of systemic discrimination and disadvantage. These are concepts that right now in formal models, I think it's very fair to say there's relatively little work on that. I just want to mention David McMillan, who got his PhD here this year. That's exactly what his dissertation is trying to address. So these, we say, oh, this looks very mathematical, you have all this jargon, et cetera. At the end of the day, these models speak to profound phenomena. Okay, so let me finish up by just making a couple of comments about facts and models and policy. I want to basically say three things. The first is that if you take the social perspective carefully, it actually makes you think about redistribution differently. Conventionally, we talk about redistribution as about giving people money or tax and transfer. You tax the rich, you give things to the poor. Maybe I could make it health insurance, but it's kind of in kind. It's an in-kind variant of that. What I want to argue is that if you take these social determinants of inequality seriously, there's something else that you might want to think about redistributing. And those are what I'm going to call associations. Consider housing policy. There are zoning restrictions throughout the United States that inhibit the construction of apartment buildings in communities that have single-family dwellings. Those are the policies that allow for economics, that help facilitate economic segregation of neighborhoods. And so by changing those rules, you change who's going to live with who. Another example would be changing things such as the location of schools. Mariana Laverty got her PhD a year ago from Harris and was looking at the effects of housing voucher policies in Boston and found something remarkable. The effects in helping the poorer families were substantially inhibited because the good schools were located far away from them. And so the transportation costs, which are very serious matters in this context, was actually an inhibiting factor. So again, the point is, if you take this type of stuff seriously, you begin to think about the location of resources in the society geographically, what the costs are in order to access them. You think about school busing to achieve integration, or you think about housing, charter schools, et cetera. Those are all policies that have to do with thinking about which students go where and are matched to what schools. And the two other examples of associational redistribution are going to be admissions policies for universities and hiring policies for firms. That's where affirmative action comes in. That's where you think about what are the appropriate rules for institutions. Now, in doing that, what I want to emphasize is that means that you inevitably have to think about ethics. And you will have lectures in this program that focus on that. And I'm saying something at one level, it's a banality. I say you ought to, the very statement, this is a good policy, means I ought to do it. It is typically to say I ought to do it. And you then have to think about what are the ethical considerations in policy evaluation. So what are the sorts of things you're going to be taught here? Well, much of what you're going to learn are different ways to think about ethics. One of them will be so-called welfarist approaches, where you try to choose policies to affect the distribution of well-being in a society. Another thing you're going to do is learn about deontological approaches that will say certain things are just, certain things are unjust. In other words, certain sources of inequality are things that society has a duty, and that's where the word deontology comes from, to rectify. And there we have to talk about the role of personal responsibility in observed inequalities and the role of desert, whether you deserve things in inequalities. And of course, in doing all of that, you have to think about competing considerations. On the ethical dimension, there'll always be issues of personal autonomy, self-realization. And there's always, I put it in scare quotes, efficiency trade-offs that are discussed. And I put it in scare quotes because efficiency itself is an ethical judgment on what's efficient. My point is not to tell you this is I have very strong opinions about all of these. You can read my papers to see them. That's not relevant. What's relevant is that you understand the distinctions between welfarist visions of how policies ought to be evaluated, deontological ones, how to think about responsibility, how to think about desert, and how to think about trade-offs between other social desiderata. The final thing I want to say is that it's not enough just to talk about ethics. You also have to talk about efficacy. Now, efficacy, I think I've already touched upon, because after all, if you don't have a theory as to why something works, it's going to be often tough to make an argument that about what the policy is going to do. Now, there's obviously counterexamples of that. Many treatment effect analyses are kind of black boxes and say the policy does work. It doesn't, and they don't need to, and they're appropriately black boxes. They don't need to take a stance. But for the sorts of phenomena we're talking about, we will often need to use theory to talk about efficacy. But here I want to say two other things. The first is one has to think about political economy. In other words, what policies are politically sustainable? It's easy for me to sit back and opine on, well, I think the government should do this, that, and the other thing. If you actually want to change things, you have to ask what can generate public consensus, given the rules by which policies are implemented, what's going to actually be possible. And so there is no, political economy, analytical politics. They're fundamental to thinking about how one addresses these inequality issues. The final thing I want to say something about is robustness. And that is, there's a lot of ignorance that you face as a policymaker. In other words, there's going to be disagreements and ignorance as to what's the true model of how the society works. What's the best low dimensional approximation to it? We have uncertainty as to how strong is the evidence. In other words, there's going to be, it's not that we know what an effect is, there's going to be distributions of possible outcomes given you implement a policy, et cetera. And so an essential feature of translating the positive perspectives on inequality to the policy perspectives is to have a language that can talk about the robustness of policies. And that's something that's done at Harris, done at the University of Chicago more broadly. And that requires a particular decision theoretic language for thinking about how you make policy choices. And one of the fundamentally hard questions there is, what if I can't assign probabilities? I know it's 50-50, that it's going to have either zero effect or a certain positive effect. That's one thing. What if I don't actually know the probabilities? These, again, are tools that you'll be taught in the course of the first year. So this is really what I want to do, just kind of sum things up. I want to say that I think that what you're going to be receiving here is a huge number of dimensions for the successful conducting of successful social science and policy evaluation. You're going to learn about measurement. You're going to learn about statistics. You're going to learn about social science theory, decision theory, and philosophy. They're all fundamental to doing policy work or doing scholarly work. I haven't said anything about any of the applications that are going on here. So I've talked very abstract. I haven't talked about development or health, education, energy, political science, areas of active applied research here. And that's part of what will be exciting for you is to be able to apply the tools you're going to learn to these phenomena. And let me just conclude by saying I'm very optimistic that you're going to find your time here inspiring. So let me stop there. Thank you. So I stopped sharing the screen. Is there anything else I should do? Pardon me? So I should click on this? Hi, so I'm sorry that I'm showing my technical incompetence. In any event, I actually cannot see you, but you should just ask questions.
I think you've given everyone so much food for thought, and I know that this kicks off a wonderful week of activities and highlights wonderfully how people can expect to draw on a really wide range of disciplines to inform analysis of problems as grand as inequality, climate change, global conflict, health policy, my own favorite, in a pandemic and beyond. So this was a wonderful way to kick off the week. I'm grateful to Professor Durloff for participating and, more importantly, for all of his amazing work in this crucial area. I'm so glad to have you all here in the building. I'm just down the hall for those of you in the building, so I hope to see some of you around in the coming weeks. And welcome again to Harris for our incoming students. And welcome to all of you who were able to participate virtually. It's going to be a wonderful term of virtual and in-person activities, back to the classroom, back to speaking opportunities. So I'm delighted to have you all with us. Thank you so much.